You're listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and education institute making law work for people, places, and the planet. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support our work, consider donating at eli.org/donate.
Hi, listeners. Welcome back to another episode of People, Places, Planet. I'm your host, Dara Albrecht.
And I'm excited to do something a little different for my second to last episode as the host of this podcast.
I have ELI's podcast team with me, and we're going to talk about environmental law. Not about a specific issue or law, but how we communicate these topics personally and professionally. Now I want to introduce you to our guests. Nick Collins, the Vice President of Communications at ELI, Sebastian Duque, a Research Associate at ELI and the incoming host of People, Places, Planet, and Maya Sokoloff, our Communications Associate. Why don't you all take a minute to introduce yourselves?
Hi, my name is Nick Collins. I'm the Associate Vice President of Communications at ELI, and I started my job here at ELI about 2.5 years ago. I've got about a decade or so's worth of experience of communicating, often in these interesting spaces that are a hybrid of policy, law, but also issues that matter for everyday people, but just need to be translated. Thanks for having me.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sebastian Duque. I'm a research associate at ELI, as Dara mentioned, and I'm really excited to be coming in as the new podcast host of People, Places, Planet. And outside of the podcast, my work has ranged across all kinds of research that we do here at ELI, from oceans to local policy and local governance in the environmental field. Really excited to be here with you today, Dara.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maya. I'm the Communications Associate at ELI, and I help out with communications across all the organization. I work with all of our program staff and our projects to help share all the amazing work that we do.
Hi, team. Thank you so much for being here with me today. Let's take a moment to set the scene for our listeners. Communicating in today's world is challenging, maybe more than ever. We're surrounded by noise, flooded with content on social media, in the news, on our phones, and constantly distracted. So it's really no surprise that grabbing someone's attention and holding it is a serious task.
With the rise of social media and lots of different ways that we can get our news and information, people are consuming media rapidly. Getting someone to look at your content is a challenge, but captivating them enough to stay and give it their full attention and internalize what you're trying to say,
that is a tall order. According to a Microsoft study from 2015, the average human attention span dropped from 12 seconds in 2000 to just 8 seconds in 2013. Whether or not that number is exact today, the pattern is clear. We also know that over half of American adults read below a 6th grade reading level. And online, the average person decides in just 10 to 20 seconds whether they'll stay on your site or X out and bounce away. Now, throwing in the complexity of environmental law, which is full of detailed regulations, legalese, long timelines, and nuances, and we have a serious communication challenge on our hands. And yet, if we can't effectively explain environmental law, we risk leaving people out of important conversations about the world they live in. So that's the tension we're going to explore in today's episode. In a world saturated with information, how do we make environmental law clear, engaging, and accessible? So to kick us off, what are your reactions to these statistics? And do they resonate with the challenges you've run into when trying to communicate environmental topics to our audience?
Well, I mean, you have to imagine about how difficult it is to just get people's attention in this context. And I think that's why you see a headline that says something and then you read the article and you're like, oh, that wasn't quite a match for what the headline was. And that's because you really just have those couple of seconds, those couple of words to get someone's attention. There's a couple of different studies I know. One of them says something about 100,000 words or so a day that people read. And, people debate the specifics of it's 100,000 or 90,000 or 110,000. But I think the point is, more than anything else, people see a lot of words in a day. And so if you're going to be competing against that, you better be pretty quick about it. And people care about the clean water that comes from their tap. But then when it comes to actually the systems that ensure that that water is clean, you've got to communicate that in a very short period of time. And that's difficult.
Yeah, there's also an audience dimension to trying to capture people's attention, especially from ELI's perspective. As the Environmental Law Institute, a good chunk of our audience and the people that we're trying to reach are lawyers and policymakers and people who are in this world and therefore have a more technical understanding of some of these laws and policies and how they affect our environment. But on the other hand, we also want to appeal and reach the everyday person who maybe doesn't have this technical background to understand the letter of the law, but still need to understand how these laws and policies impact them at the most basic level.
And I think I'd reiterate something Nick briefly mentioned. A lot of this draws the attention toward headlines with big titles, right? And a lot of these big titles oftentimes choose to highlight the negatives, especially in the environmental context. But relying on fear or doom or anxiety can only really take us so far. While it might spark attention, it doesn't necessarily sustain it. So to truly engage people, we need to move beyond the negative framing and explore other perspectives. After all, constantly focusing on what's going wrong is both unsustainable and uninspiring.
It's just essential to consider how we communicate information, especially when you realize just how many options folks have for where they get their news and information today. We're living in a digital world where people are on multiple social platforms, working all day over email, flooded with notifications, constantly connected, and honestly, it is exhausting. News fatigue is real. And so in this environment, the way we communicate matters. It can either invite someone in and make them curious, or it can overwhelm them and push them away, especially when the topic is something as complex as environmental law. So thanks, team, for painting that picture for our listeners. And that brings us to ELI. Our mission is to make law work for people, places, and the planet. And what that really means is helping translate complex legal, policy, and science concepts, which are developed by brilliant lawyers, scientists, and policymakers, into something that's understandable and accessible for everyone. Because if people can't understand the law, they can't use it. And if they can't use it, we miss a critical opportunity for real change in communities, ecosystems, and systems of power. And that's what we're working on through ELI's new communications work, building a bridge between legal expertise and public understanding.
And so part of what we have to consider is how we are actually getting people to fully understand how these things affect their everyday life and where they can plug in to make the difference that they want to make.
Thanks so much for pointing that out, Nick. So, why does communicating environmental law matter now more than ever? Why are we dedicating a whole podcast episode to this topic?
Well, as Dara and Nick started to mention, people are so integral to effective environmental law and policy. But these days, people are sort of disconnected from the legal system and how it impacts them directly. There is a disconnect between what is happening in their front yard or in their local communities and how and where those policies come from, where those decisions come from. So it's important to break down those systems and how they are reaching people in their lives where they can see the direct impact of them. At the end of the day, a huge part of communicating environmental law is explaining to people why they should care about these issues and how they can impact their lives.
Interesting point, Maya. So, what makes communicating environmental law different from other areas of legal or public discourse? Because there are issues other than environmental issues that are affecting people too. Are there structural, ethical, or cultural dimensions that complicate the task of communicating environmental issues specifically?
When thinking about the environmental law field, I would think of it unique because it lies at the interface between environmental science and environmental politics. So, for example, environmental law relies uniquely, as compared to other fields of law, on fields such as ecology, toxicology, climate modeling, etc., to define harms, determine thresholds, and in turn be able to craft laws and regulations. It's through these processes, for example, that the Safe Drinking Water Act is able to define legally enforceable standards for contaminants that apply to public water systems. So this goes to explaining what parts per billion is in a way that makes abstract risk meaningful and is easily understood by the public. This unique interface is what results in some of those unique structural, cultural, and ethical dimensions that complicate the task of communicating environmental law. As far as structural dimensions that shape environmental law, one thing that really complicates its communication is the multi-jurisdictional level that environmental law is located in. So you can find environmental governance at the local level, at the state level, at the national level, at the tribal level, or at the international level. And oftentimes, one environmental law will involve one or multiple of these parties.
And so, when you're communicating the role that a law plays in a person's everyday life, it can be difficult to help them pinpoint who or what in their community is responsible. Who should they reach out to if they have questions? Their city, their state, or the federal government? Another complexity that I think fits into the structural or institutional category is the jargon that is used when people discuss these laws. Statutes like the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act are long, complex, riddled with exceptions and processes. They're full of scientific and legal principles that require translation for people who are not experts in the field. But to even start discussing the complex aspects of these laws, lawyers and other experts need to drop the shorthand names. For example, Section 404 permits, though the technically accurate name, means nothing to someone who does not know the Clean Water Act inside and out. Instead, say permits for the discharge of dredged or fill material, though even that will require further explanation.
As far as cultural dimensions, such as values or identity that can shape people's perception, this is very important because it requires that when we're doing environmental communication, we navigate really contentious political, social, and cultural landscapes. People have really diverse worldviews on what nature means, on what property means, on our responsibility to the environment and to each other. And all of these are crucial questions when it comes to communicating environmental law, defining environmental law, practicing environmental law, and when you're communicating it.
I think you have to be aware that there are also a lot of communities that are distrustful of the institutions that are responsible for environmental policy making and enforcement.
And that is something else that when you're doing environmental communications, you need to bring into the picture.
I love that you brought up people's different perspectives because one thing I think about a lot in our work is that we all live in different environments and we are all seeing and perceiving the world around us. If you're explaining something like chemistry or engineering, for example, you're often dealing with controlled systems. You can point to formulas, measurements, or a blueprint, and there's usually a right or wrong answer. You could replicate a chemical reaction in a lab, or you can test the strength and load of a bridge. But with environmental issues, especially relating to ecological change or environmental justice, you're communicating about something that people are living in and experiencing every day. Someone could say, this area looks fine to me, while someone else just down the road could be facing water contamination or air pollution and say, this area doesn't look fine to me. Sometimes a broader ecosystem might appear stable, but the way it's managed could be harming one part of a community and helping another. So in a way, we're not just communicating science or policy, we're communicating people's lived experiences. And that adds another layer of complexity to how we tell these stories.
To add to that, part of what makes environmental law so different is the fact that the environment exists all around us all the time. It's not necessarily something we can remove ourselves from. So it has a really human and emotional aspect to it because it is something that we all live in, we all interact with in all these different ways. So environmental law has the added complexity of not only navigating a legal framework, but also real human lives and emotions with it.
There's also ethical dimensions relating to justice, responsibility, and moral obligation. So a good example of this is the idea of intergenerational responsibility. Is there a need to consider future generations when dealing with long-term harms that come from environmental issues? And so when we're thinking about communication, how can we properly communicate those long-term harms that will not be felt by this generation, but by future ones to our audience, right?
And to the point we made earlier, too, further complicated by the fact that not everyone shares those values.
Not everyone necessarily thinks that we should consider these intergenerational harms when we make these decisions.
Another dimension for me is that I'm fascinated when I think about how our brains work, like the psychology of how we take in information. Humans are wired to live in the moment, and there's actual research showing it's really hard for humans to imagine our future selves or to fully grasp how we'll feel or what things will be like down the road. And that makes it especially tough when we're trying to talk about environmental issues that are long-term or unfolding slowly. Like we've mentioned plenty of times before, we're also up against how people consume information now. Our habits of consuming media and our internal biases really shape how people receive and respond to what we're saying. So it's not just about crafting the right message. It's also being sensitive to how people process it, emotionally, mentally, and even biologically.
So, can y'all think of a time where you saw environmental communication done well or poorly, and what made it so?
I'll actually talk about one that I think kind of did both. I think, the campaign around 1.5 degrees Celsius was wildly successful in that it became pretty ubiquitous when we were talking about where we're headed and the target lines that we're trying to avoid. The 1.5 degrees Celsius question is really powerful, but it's also, to those who aren't in the know like we are every day, also kind of confusing. I mean, it's in Celsius, so there's a good chunk of people who don't even understand what Celsius is. And then beyond that, then it sort of sets this
Bright red line, right?
Like once we cross 1.5, is it over? And a lot of people sort of then gained that perception. Like, well, we're going to pass 1.5, so I guess it doesn't matter. Where, of course, if you knew and were well versed in this and are in it like we are, we know that that report and all language around that is talking about how every point degree matters and changes the scales of magnitude on impact. But what got conveyed was 1.5. So wildly successful in that everybody knows it, and also wildly unsuccessful in that like there's a nuance there that doesn't always translate or get picked up. And I think it's a microcosm of how difficult it is to communicate about these sorts of issues that are so deeply complex and nuanced.
So I also have an example that is along the lines of good, but that I've also seen done not as well. It's the example of using visuals to communicate environmental risks, right? Specifically, I'm thinking about art that I've seen commissioned by cities or local art institutions to highlight a message. It's something that I've seen go very well or not so well in different ways and in different cases. Something that artists in a lot of these cities or institutions have begun doing is trying to communicate local sea level rise through art. So using art to show, for example, in 2050, the sea level is predicted to rise here by this much. I know this was something that was being done back in Miami, where the expected amount of sea level rise was being painted onto intersections as part of a citywide art installation. I'm not too sure how it was received in Miami by the residents, but from my first glance, this is the kind of art installation that its success really relies on how much community follow-up there is. Perhaps to educate the community on what exactly that number means and what it would represent in terms of specific local impacts. I think without follow-up, it even leaves a lot of questions unanswered, such as, is this assuming 1.5 degrees warming or 2 degrees warming? And so, unless the goal is simply trying to raise awareness on a very primary level, I think it's important these kinds of installations go beyond just indicating the level the sea is expected to rise, because that can really oversimplify the issue to Nick's point. And you don't even learn anything about what you can do about it, right? And so I've always found that these types of art installations can be very interesting examples of effective ways of communicating, but without proper attention, they might also not be very effective.
And to make a point on that too, it's in places that are often the least responsible for causing climate change and sea level rise, right? It's in communities that historically are probably disproportionately affected by the effects of climate change while also not contributing equally to it. So it's a little bit of like a, wow, cool, yeah, you made a point, but like to who? For what reason?
Yeah, that's a really interesting example, Sebastian. And one that comes to mind is a little bit similar in the way that it uses data and data visualization to communicate sustainability. I lived in Montreal for a number of years, and one thing that they started implementing while I was there were these bike trackers that they would set up next to the bike lanes. And Montreal is a pretty bike-friendly city, but it's not perfect, and there's always ways to improve. And these bike trackers would, in real time, calculate the people who were biking by in the bike lanes and gradually add up over the months so that people could see in real time how many people had chosen to bike that day and how many people had taken that bike path. And I thought it was a really interesting way to communicate the immediate impacts of one's decision and how they contribute to sustainability efforts and to helping the environment. So I think one thing that this demonstrates to me is how simple but targeted attempts at communicating about the environment and about the impact that everyday decisions can be a really powerful way to get people to think about their own decisions and think about how they chose to travel and transport themselves and encourage people to make decisions with sustainability in mind. Is this a perfect way to communicate about environmental impacts? No. I mean, you're missing information about how your choices make an impact in the broader sense. What is this doing for climate change? What is this doing for emissions? None of that is fully communicated in this tracker on the side of the road. But does it get people to stop for a second and think about their choices? Yes. And I think that is where the power behind it comes in.
Thanks for providing those examples. So let's talk a little bit more about bridging the communication gap. What are some common missteps legal professionals make when trying to communicate with a general audience?
Well, I should start by saying I'm not a lawyer. I do have a policy background and have been around legal and policy issues for most of my career. And I love lawyers. However, they are incredibly technically accurate. I think they share this trait with scientists. And so, on one hand, excellent, required for their job and what they need to do in order to be good at what they do. But that doesn't always translate to good communications. Not that communications shouldn't be accurate, but sometimes we need to say something in less words and just more directly than trying to get it exactly technically correct. And so I do find often that there's a struggle between like, what can we say that is right enough so that we can communicate what needs to be communicated without getting stuck on adding a whole bunch of qualifiers or thises or commas and ands and all the things that get added on when we start to workshop the language. And I do think there's also an over-reliance on jargon, especially, I mean, all policy people start to call the laws fun names, RCRA and CERCLA, and you say these things offhandedly and you don't really think about it.
But the reality is people don't know what those are. And so you have to move back from some of that jargon.
Totally. Like instead of saying the p-value was below 0.05, you could say the data strongly shows a connection between X or Y, or we're confident this result isn't random. It's often clearer to just say this pattern keeps showing up even when we factor in other variables. So keeping the science accurate, but making it actually land with people, especially when they're not technical experts.
Exactly. Yes. That's a really good example.
So like you said, it's really important to be accessible. And even calling back that statistic I said, over half of Americans read below a 6th grade reading level. It's very important to make our language understood by everyone. But at the same time, like you said, there are issues of being technically accurate, making sure we're communicating the right thing and not misleading folks through flashy headlines or intentionally crafted statements that might occlude we're really trying to communicate. Or even just for the issue of legal defensiveness, making sure that what you say can really stand up in every situation. So how do you balance this need for accuracy with the overall goal of being accessible to people, especially in science or law, which are, like you said, highly technical subjects?
You know, Dara, I actually think about this question a lot. I had this professor in college who would always say that
She wanted us to write our essays like we were writing them so that our grandparents could read them.
And I remember at first I would think,
Okay, well, my grandma didn't go to college and doesn't speak English, so what do I do? However, my parents also don't speak English that well. So when I think of how to communicate with them, for example, what I do for work, I don't like the idea of, oh, I'm simplifying things for them or dumbing things down, which is one way that I think people regrettably describe the way that they communicate with non-experts. What I've learned over time is that when we're distilling these big, complex topics, we should think of it more like translating. And translating has a lot to do with knowing your audience, right? So, for example, my parents are actually very educated. They're just educated in Spanish, right? And so I know that I can talk to them about very complex scientific things. I just can't do it in the English language in which I am most comfortable talking about these complex scientific things. We have to narrow our knowledge and our conversation down to our common language. And I think it speaks a lot to how you should generally approach the target of balancing accuracy and accessibility, right? You don't have to lose the accuracy by using plain language, and you don't have to lose that meaning. It's just knowing your audience so that you understand the common language that you share and what you're able to do. And in those cases, even in cases where maybe you don't share a common language as much, you can use other things to try to get where you need to. So you can use metaphors or some other sort of analogy to draw comparisons to something that might be more relevant to their life. And I think something else that's important is summarizing and really thinking about your audience. If you know your audience, what do they actually need to know and what do they want to know? And that can be a subjective process of deciding what is most relevant to somebody else. But at the same time, I think it's important because you don't want to overwhelm someone with information.
Something else that I think connects to trying to meet different types of audiences where they're at, and something that I've learned from this job, is that you can present information at different levels and allow people to reach what works best for them. So you start with something simple that conveys the most basic of what needs to be conveyed. And then you offer additional resources for people who want to go further in depth, who want to learn more about this topic or this issue or this new report that you've just published, so that you're able to create content that reaches across many different levels of interest and expertise. So giving the opportunity to choose what they want to consume or what level they want to consume at is also an important aspect of reaching a wide variety of audiences.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we're kind of circling around right now is also storytelling. It's meeting people where they're at to actually tell them what they need to know. I mean, I think about a lot of conversation right now is around energy and how we're going to structure energy for the country moving forward. And there's a lot of different ways to talk about it. You could talk about it from a climate change perspective and say that it's a moral imperative, but that only gets a certain amount of people on board. You can talk about it from an economic perspective, which does get a lot more people on board. You can talk about it from a job opportunity perspective, and that gets different people involved. And so I think it's really about finding the different angles to talk about these topics as a bridge to the nuance and the complex, and not leading with the nuance and complexity, which I think is very difficult sometimes for lawyers and scientists, because rightfully so. I mean, that's what they've been trained to do. They're very intelligent people in that aspect. But it's about taking a step back and saying, what's the story we can tell here to get people interested in that complexity and nuance?
Maya and Sebastian, what role does storytelling play in your work here, and how do you use it?
Storytelling is incredibly important to everything we do when we're trying to get people to care and understand how these issues impact their lives directly. It ties back to where we started at the beginning of the podcast, talking about why is it important to communicate about environmental law and why should people care? And this is where really the storytelling aspect comes in. We can take a report on hard rock mining or fisheries in Belize, and we have all of this amazing information behind it. But how do you then tell people that they should be interested, or they should care, that this research and this data and this policy and these laws really impact their lives? So storytelling is a way to humanize all of this and to make meaningful connections with people and meet them where they're at. At ELI, we engage in storytelling in so many different forms, including this podcast, first and foremost. What is more storytelling than getting people together to sit down and talk about these important issues and their knowledge and what they are doing to tackle these pressing issues in their own words? Then you have other aspects of storytelling, like in written form with our blog and our events and webinars are other aspects of storytelling. And so having diverse forms of media and diverse ways to reach people ensures that you can reach people regardless of how they absorb information and how they best take in information.
Well, and it's interesting you should say that because I think something really interesting about the legal and policy field and perspective is that usually written is king. A lot of times there's a high emphasis placed on written work. And if it's not written, it's not real, which is true to some degree, but also nearly all of the data around how people consume things and whether they decide to engage with media content or information in general does not merit out that written is king. Color alone can play a factor in how likely somebody is to adopt something or read it or take it on. And people make subconscious judgments about products within a couple of seconds of viewing. And between 62% and 90% of that assessment is based on color alone. And it's all subconscious. So how do you balance a profession that is so keen on written and starting to get them to see that if you actually want to convey your information, like you've got to think about how this looks too, because otherwise people ain't going to be reading it.
That makes me think of a really successful example of environmental communications, which are nature documentaries. One of the first things that you hear when you tell people, I work in the environmental space, is everybody's seen 1 or 2 or 20, in my case, environmental documentaries. And when you watch these videos, they're great cameras, really aesthetic, well put together, like the BBC, National Geographic. And there's a narrator telling you about the animals, telling you about its behaviors, maybe sharing 1 or 2 ecosystem services, but really letting you watch these ecosystems and services in action, drawing people in to care in that way.
Let's think about a video that captures a rare rainfall in the desert. You can watch a big rainfall transform the landscape. Flowers bloom, dry riverbeds fill, all the animals come out. And just like that, you're witnessing erosion, sediment movement, water cycling without any heavy-handed explanations.
You know, observing a caribou in a tundra for 20 minutes could lead you to think about glacial melting, lead you to think about nutrient cycling in tundras, and then hopefully draw in a viewer to try and understand a little bit more of the world around them without overwhelming them with information they don't know or isn't something they'd want to consume in their downtime.
Just to keep going on this, something that I think you have to understand when you're communicating about these difficult topics and complex issues is that much of what you do isn't going to be the thing that pushes someone over the edge into taking action. In a lot of ways, we're like gardeners and we're sort of just tilling soil. Human psychology is crazy. You need to be told things multiple times before it finally sinks in. And then usually what happens at a certain point is that
You come to realizations that seem sudden, but the garden has actually been tilled for quite some time.
And I think nature documentaries are a great example of that, because very rarely is somebody watching a nature documentary and going out there afterward and becoming like, I'm going to save all the animals. I mean, maybe some folks are, but what's happening is you're slowly loosening up the brain and making the brain think like, oh, animals are pretty cool. And then you keep having that message, and then eventually you take some action on it because animals are pretty cool, right? And so it's about that slow shift over time and getting people comfortable and open to ideas so that you can start to have more complex, action-oriented communications with them.
So there's no shortage of people speaking out on environmental issues, but not all voices seem to break through. Where do you all see the most potential to strengthen how we communicate these messages so they resonate more widely and influence public understanding or even policy?
I'll take a very basic example. People care about being able to go to their faucet and turn the faucet on and put water in a cup and drink that water to be safe and healthy. But the thing about caring is that they only care when it's not there. It's very difficult to get people to care about things that are ongoing, that already exist, that are systems we've created that function pretty dang well. I mean, there's a couple of exceptions where we need to do better in certain places in the country, undoubtedly. But when those systems are not thought of or considered, it's very easy for those systems to then degrade or be taken advantage of or be diminished. And I think we're sort of in a moment now where we're at risk of that. And so this is the hardest part, is how do you communicate about all of the great things we actually have done from an environmental perspective because of government, because of policy, because of these legal systems we've created, when there's an increasing distrust and a narrative out there that government is ineffective and inefficient. And then, in fact, what ends up happening then is it kind of proves its point, right? We take away resources from government, it then becomes less efficient and less effective. And then now we're in this sort of cycle downward. And it's not actually connected to the reality, which is that we've actually done some pretty awesome stuff. I mean, you used to not be able to drink water out of your faucet pretty comfortably in most places. We can do that now. Not everywhere, obviously, but in most places. But I want to flip the script a little bit because I get to listen to all the podcast episodes and review them in my role, but I don't get to ask questions. So I want to ask you two, Dara and Sebastian, what have you discovered about the benefits or limits of communicating environmental complexity through the podcast, People, Places, Planet?
Thanks for your question, Nick. It's definitely interesting to be on the other side of the podcast mic. So I think that People, Places, Planet is a wonderful way to introduce our listeners
to dimensions of environmental law that they didn't realize were affecting their everyday lives.
And I think one of the greatest strengths we have on People, Places, Planet is that it's a bit of a more relaxed forum to educate. When I talk to our guests, sometimes we're breaking down environmental statutes, or we're talking about books or theories or major issues that could affect us all as a country. But I love starting out with getting to know the guests, hearing their interests, and hearing about why they care about environmental law. And I think by getting to know individuals on People, Places, Planet, our listeners can break down a little bit more of that environmental complexity.
I also love getting to ask questions as they come to mind. So obviously, when you're producing a podcast professionally, like with People, Places, Planet, we do our research beforehand. We know sort of what questions we're going to ask. But I always leave myself wiggle room. And that's because when I sit in the podcast seat, I think of myself as a learner too. When we're recording an episode, I'm worried about learning and making sure that the messages come through and land. That's my priority. Sometimes I like to get down in the nitty-gritty and tell an expert, wait, hold on. What is that? What does that mean? Would X, Y, and Z example cover that? I feel like because I'm putting myself in the learner's shoes, I can almost identify what questions the public might have or what areas of confusion there could be, and you have a chance to correct it in the moment. I think in other forms of media, you don't necessarily have that opportunity. This advantage gets overlooked a lot, but podcasts are actually one of the most accessible ways to get information out to people. And I don't just mean the content, I mean that as long as you have a pair of headphones and something to do, you can listen to a podcast on your own time anywhere. I know when I'm reviewing our episodes, sometimes I'm doing chores, sometimes I'm sitting in the office, sometimes I'm taking a walk. I can pause, listen to it in 10-minute chunks, 20-minute chunks, or the whole way through. This is a low barrier way to learn, and we can reach diverse non-expert audiences. Now, I will say there are also some disadvantages. First of all, I would point out the lack of visual aids. I think that having visuals is so important. Audio can be really helpful, but I do think sometimes people need video. For example, when we were recording our Safe Drinking Water Act episode, we can talk about how water goes from groundwater to some kind of facility to underground pipes, eventually to the taps in your house. But instead of explaining all that in detail, wouldn't it be easier to just paint a picture of a faucet or pipe and give people a visual that they can look at? It's well known that recall is actually much better through videos and pictures, and sometimes it's hard to squeeze information in through such a short episode. Also, I think this is just the nature of podcasts that there isn't real-time interaction, like there is with maybe a webinar or a live class. Listeners can't ask questions or seek clarification immediately, so the onus is really on us to make sure we get the product and the communication on the mark the first time.
I haven't been in the host chair yet. Soon you'll get to know me, but while I've been editing, something that I've really enjoyed from the podcast, kind of similarly to Dara, has been that conversational angle that podcasts are really able to bring. And I think, especially even when there's current events and things that come up, the podcasts are a much more flexible medium in the moment to have a bit more of a candid conversation than maybe it is over writing.
And I think it opens doors to have these oftentimes difficult conversations.
But I think one limit that I really feel over the podcast is that people view it conversationally, but they view it as a professional
And informational conversation geared towards an audience of lawyers and policymakers. But really, our aim here at ELI is to reach a much broader audience, but they are hesitant to lean into more flexible content forms. I think the beauty of a podcast is how engaging they can be for everybody, not just experts. And as Dara noted, people listen to these podcasts while they're cooking or taking a walk because they are conversational. So in that sense, we have to challenge people to keep that conversational attitude and not get too caught up in the formalities.
So let's chat a little bit about communicating today and onward. In today's day and age, what's the value in prioritizing effective environmental communication?
I mean, I touched upon this a little bit earlier, but I do think we have a real imperative right now to communicate what has been effective. And I think that there's a real conversation to be had right now in the United States, at least, about the effectiveness of governance and what we've been able to accomplish. And for some folks, it hasn't been effective enough. And there is space for us to have more effective governance. And the only way that we're going to get there is by actually continuing to have those conversations. We do need to continue to make government more effective if we're going to solve environmental problems. But the only way we're going to get there is by having, I think, these frank conversations, Sebastian, that you were alluding to earlier. We actually have to sit down and talk about what are the barriers in place, not just for government to be effective, but for that policy to actually be effective in delivering the environmental outcomes that we want it to without overly hampering businesses, without harming communities, without doing all of the other externalities that we don't think about all the time. I think we're at a real junction point right now where if we don't do that effectively and we don't use a communications lens to communicate what's at stake, but also what's possible, I think we're at a real risk point right now where we could watch a lot of backsliding happen and we could lose a lot of these effective systems that we've built and maybe not have something to put in place. The other really complex part about this is that a lot of the decisions that we need to make need to be rooted in evidence and science. And with a lot of the conversation unfolding right now, there's a real risk to losing some of that scientific evidence gathering for these decisions that need to be made.
And without that strong evidence base, we are at risk of making ineffective law and policy.
So, with all of these issues, how do you all approach disagreement or even polarization when we're trying to have discussions about environmental issues?
You know, I think it has a lot to do with what we just discussed regarding misinformation. Part of polarization comes from the misinformation sphere that we have now, especially online, right? It enables us all to live in separate spheres that just don't even make sense to each other because we have completely different information bases. And I think when entering these conversations where it feels like you're in stark disagreement with the other person, the other thing that I would say is really important is to have empathy and going back to translation, trying to find that common language between the two of you. And so maybe even if this person doesn't believe in this scientific principle, which you think is like so fundamental, find something else that maybe the two of you can agree upon. And so something I think about a lot, I grew up in Miami, and something that everyone can agree on in Miami is that hurricanes are real. No matter where you come from, everybody has lived through a hurricane in Miami. We all know they happen. We all know they have stark impacts. And so when we talk about hurricane or extreme weather resiliency in Miami, it's
Not really something that is as politicized as in other parts of the country, right? Despite any polarization, it's an example of a way to find common language in Miami, to find common ground.
Maya and I discussed earlier about how it can sometimes be difficult to talk to people about environmental issues because everyone has their own perceptions and biases. But what we didn't mention is that that's actually also a major strength, because I think common ground is so helpful to all of this. We can ask people what they're perceiving. So maybe a recreational hunter notices that the size and quantity of the deer that they've seen in the last 5 seasons is decreasing, or even just someone observing the color and clarity and the taste of the tap water that comes out of their sink. If you talk to people, you can hear the things they're observing and then possibly introduce them to some environmental mechanisms or science and help them connect what they're seeing to possibly what could be part of a bigger pattern. If a farmer is saying that their growing seasons have been very difficult because of increased drought, then maybe they would be more inclined to look at a hydrology table from the last 10 years and see how impacts on their growing season could be correlated with increases in heat or changes in the water table, or even what kind of pesticides are being used and if that could be affecting the pollinators. I think the key is just getting to the common ground and then possibly introducing some scientific or legal mechanisms. That can be the best way to get past what might seem like a disagreement, but what is truly underneath just a lack of common understanding. So, if each of you could give one piece of advice to someone trying to make environmental law accessible, what would it be?
I think one of the most important things, and this sort of ties back to what you were just talking about, Dara, but to make environmental law accessible, it's about meeting people where they're at. So whatever you're communicating about, I always try and think about, what does this mean at a most basic level for the broad public? What does this mean for our audience? And it might not be, oh, this new law says XYZ. It might be, this is what's going to happen, or this is what might happen, or we risk clean water, we risk clean air. Whatever is the most concrete impact that people will see and feel in their daily lives, I think is where you have the opportunity to make an impact and to reach people and be heard. And from there, we sort of mentioned, they can dive into a topic however deep they want to, but trying to find stories that will resonate with people is, I think, the most important place to begin.
Maya, what you just said reminds me of something we had a speaker, I think 2 podcasts ago, in a book that ELI published, Adapting to High Level Warming. There's an excellent chapter by Professor Sarah Fox who talks about climate change communities. And, there are the basic climate change communities who may be coastline communities or communities affected by certain drought or weather events. But what she also introduces is the idea that communities that might be at first glance relatively unaffected can experience ripple effects. And I think getting people to understand that issues might affect them in ways that they may not anticipate, whether that's internal climate migration, people who are moving to escape increased storms, or agricultural or city infrastructure systems that are now having to handle much more stress than they were originally designed to, can all be effects of that. And I think that just ties in so nicely to what you just said.
If I'd offer one piece of advice, it would be ABC, audience before content. Figure out who you're trying to communicate with, number one, and then think about how they want to be communicated with. Folks receive information in all sorts of different ways, through different channels, at different times, in different languages. And so without defining who your audience is, you're kind of yelling into the void, and you might not be communicating in the way that's going to be helpful for the people who need to hear it. So if you start there, you'll have a better shot at communicating what you need to communicate.
My piece of advice is really interwoven with the way I approach my podcast and I approach my work. But my advice is simply to talk to people. If you don't understand, ask questions and talk to people. And sometimes the best way to practice your communication skills is to be on the other side of the learning table. Find someone who is an expert in something you know nothing about. Because I think one of you mentioned earlier, we work in the environmental space. And sometimes we get so deep that we think everybody knows these sorts of things. Nick said sometimes we have a tendency in the environmental law space to throw around big acronyms. We think that people know what that means, but they don't. Find someone who knows about a subject you know nothing about, whether that is a video game, literature, art history, and ask them to explain it to you. And see what resonates and see what doesn't. And if you experience being on the other side of the learning table, maybe when you're trying to explain your topic of expertise, you can understand a little bit more about what works and what doesn't work for others when you want them to really process what you're saying. And finally, how do you all measure success in communication? Is it folks just engaging with your content, really reaching a high level of understanding, changed behavior, large-scale policy shifts, or something else?
Dara, this is such a good question, and it sort of speaks to one of the most complicated, difficult parts about communications. In an ideal world, I'm able to track behavioral shifts and policy shifts as a result of communication, right? But it's often not linear. I mean, to the point I was making earlier about our brains being a little bit like gardens that we've got to till. It's like, well, I tilled that garden a couple of times and a flower sprouted there eventually. Can I claim credit for that flower, at least partial credit? I don't know. And then also tracking all of those different things. I mean, we're working internationally, so being able to track all these things, people don't reach out to you and say, hey, by the way, you did this thing and I've adopted a new law or policy as a result of it. Like, that doesn't happen. And so it's hard to track the things that you actually want to track, the things that would actually measure. Are we doing what we need to do in our communication to actually elicit change? And so we then fall to sort of metrics that act as a proxy for how effective we are. Like, how much engagement are we getting on a post? How many likes or retweets are we getting? But those are kind of shells of what's possible. And so we do our best to try to scan people on our lists or people who are in our orbit, like doing things that are related to policies or laws or legal recommendations that we're putting forth. But it's a tough one.
Yeah, I would echo that emphasis on the metrics. Nowadays, like, how can we get the numbers up and up? But I think the most meaningful feedback that I've gotten on the podcast during the time that I've been working on it was about 2 or 4 weeks ago when we published the wetlands episode, and somebody posted a comment on the podcast episode saying that they were really happy to see wetlands get some attention. And I was like, finally, some feedback. This is great. Because otherwise, all we have to rely on is these abstract numbers that really tell us very little about how good of a job we're doing communicating. And so when I saw this comment, I was so excited to know that there was somebody out there that was excited that we were touching on this topic.
And so I'd encourage folks not to just like posts or podcasts that they see online, but to try to engage with them a little more in a sincere way, because that could really help us content creators understand your needs, our audience's needs. Finally, before we hop off, Dara, I just want to congratulate you on your magnificent year as podcast host. She's been an absolutely wonderful mentor in this process of getting to know the podcast and environmental communications in general, and someone that I'm also happy to call a friend. And I also do want to give a big shout out to Maya, who is also leaving ELI this summer and will be going off to grad school. So I'm just overwhelmingly proud of the both of them and so excited for the future that they hold.
Dara, you've done such an excellent job on the podcast. I think some of my favorite episodes that have ever been produced have been under not just your creation, but your sort of brainstorming. Like, you've really honed in on how do we bring a crosscut of people together in an episode. And I think it's worked really well. And I'm so grateful for everything you've done for the podcast. And I'm going to miss you. Wish you all the best in law school. And I know that our paths are going to cross again someday as an environmental lawyer and a communicator. Maybe you'll be a guest on the podcast.
Just to echo what Nick has said, it has been such a pleasure working with you for these past year and a half. And you put so much time and energy and effort into everything that you do. And it really shows in the podcast that you've created. So shout out, Dara.
Thank you all for all those wonderful thoughts. And that brings us to the end of today's podcast. I just want to take a moment to tell you, the audience, thank you so much for tuning in with me every 2 weeks to learn about different environmental law topics. I'm so glad to bring you all of these experts and wonderful guests, but it's also been such a privilege to learn. I'm going to be heading off to law school this fall, and I know that because of this experience, I will become a much better advocate and environmental communicator. It's been such an honor working at ELI, and having the chance to take the reins on a leading environmental law podcast has taught me a lot about what works and what doesn't when it comes to communicating environmental law. And I just want to say thank you so much to the rest of the podcast team, to Nick for his steady guidance and wonderful instincts, to Maya for her quick thinking and unwavering support, and to Sebastian for truly being the most wonderful host I could imagine to come on and lead the podcast. We could not have produced such a wonderful year's worth of episodes without you. So I just want to take a moment to express my heartfelt gratitude. Thank you again to the audience for giving me the privilege of being your host for the year. This has been People, Places, Planet.
And I'll see you in 2 weeks for my final episode. Thanks so much. It's been an honor.
Thanks for listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute. Our work wouldn't be possible without the support of people like you. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, attend one of our events, or support our work financially, head to eli.org.